Hello and welcome back to another episode of Through the Eyes of Enji, where we're trying to cover 101 films in probably a bit more than 365 days, raising some money for the Shawbury Village players, and we are with you. Now, this time we're looking at The Boondock Saints, which was released in 1999, directed and written by Troy Duffy. It stars William Dafoe as Paul Smecker, Sean Patrick Flannery as Connor McManus, Norman Reedus as Murphy McManus, David Della Rocco as Rocco, and Billy Connolly as Il Duque. Two Irish Catholic brothers become vigilantes and wipe out Boston's criminal underworld in the name of God. Oh, cry. Right, okay, so watching Boondock Saints, I got the strong impression that the making of the film is actually more interesting than the film itself. So the film was also released around about the time as the documentary Overnight, which documents the making of the film and Troy Duffy's somewhat tumultuous relationship with Miramax and Harvey Weinstein. And the impression I got after watching the film and doing a bit of reading is that the film is as loud and obnoxious as its writer and director. And I definitely found myself wondering whether Troy Duffy's rise to, well, infamy, really, would have been possible without the appearance of Robert Rodriguez, Quentin Tarantino, and Kevin Smith, and the popularity of indie films in the 1990s. And given that there is very much a early Tarantino-esque vibe going on through here, no, I don't think so. And it's almost a shame in a way, because there are some very talented actors who got roped into doing this, and I just had to wonder why and how. There's a story about Troy Duffy going to meeting Ewan McGregor and expecting it just to be a piss up, where the two would get drunk and just talk, and Ewan McGregor would want to do the film, which wasn't the case by a very long shot. And with some of the actors, it almost feels like we've got really good actors who just did whatever they wanted because they had a director who couldn't control them and didn't want to control what they were doing. William Dafoe, I'm looking directly at you. And there's almost something quite uncomfortable going on under the skin of the film and I'll get to some of the circumstances around the film a bit later on, but having two vigilantes who dub themselves judge, jury, and executioner because they're sent by God, it seems like a very flimsy reason for them to go on that what is really a murderous rampage. Watching it and, trying, being really open to it, because when I read the description of the film, I thought, 90s action film, the vigilantes, I get a kick out of some films like this. I love Dirty Harry. I love a lot of films like this, but I struggled to get Boondock Saints. And I don't know whether or not that was helped or hindered by the appearance of Billy Connolly. I love Billy Connolly. Seen him live, love his comedy, definitely up my street, but his role as Il Duque, meaning the ghost, is a great example of showing rather than telling. Because he's supposed to be this unbelievable, unstoppable assassin. Well, all we really see him do in that regard is walking across the street in slow motion, shooting two guns, while William Dafoe does... Actually, I'm not entirely sure what William Dafoe was doing or thinking during that scene. Was it just like him being in drag towards the end of the film? It was definitely a what the hell moment, and I'm not going to forget it anytime soon, but not, unfortunately, in a good way. And I don't know whether I was supposed to be watching like a drama or just a straight up action film, or whether it's supposed to be a dark comedy. And if it was the dark comedy, then much like the review that's going to come out in the next few days, I didn't find it very funny. Although a film that has a cat being accidentally shot off a table was never really going to tickle my funny bone. And, you know, just speaking of that, there seemed to be a lot more of the... There was a much larger emphasis on the violence itself rather than the build-up to the violence, which I found kind of ironic for a film that did seem to be aping Quentin Tarantino. With, if you look at the likes of, Django Unchained, where the build-up to the violence is just as exciting as the violence itself when it hits. And watching the film, it felt more like I was watching a teenager's wish fulfillment fantasy, rather than a film that was actually about, well, characters. And this kind of really, when we got to the end of the film, the end of the film feels almost rushed. One of the major players and the characters in the film dies, and then the film's wrapped up within about 5 minutes. And it feels almost like scenes of the chunks of the film were missing. And when the final speeches came in, this might just have been because I watched this quite late at night, and it was a case of, you know, it's 10 o'clock at night, I've got a couple of hours to kill, I'll watch Boondock Saints so I can put this review together. And the final speeches felt almost incoherent and didn't match with what had come thus far in the film. I did wonder whether I was watching a setup for a sequel that I am aware does exist, that I have watched, I just can't remember it. Take that as you will. Or whether this was just two very good actors with very good chemistry, who were just voicing the rant of a frustrated young man who wanted to be in a Punisher, Dirty Harry-esque revenge thriller with superhuman skills, and was just ranting that out through the film. And I mean, going back to what I said about not getting the film, this film does have a cult following, and I don't understand why, other than when it was released by Blockbuster Video, following the falling out with Miramax and the fact that the film was released in only 5 cinemas and grossed something like $20,000 to $30,000. This was obvious, and then the whole thing was pulled, partially due to around about the time of the Columbine massacre. So other films like The Basketball Diaries suffered a similar fate. However, the film was almost blacklisted by Miramax, which obviously could have had an impact as well, but I suppose this is in the realm of we'll never know. But a generation of fans who were working at Blockbuster Video, who saw this film when it came out, practically heralded it as the second coming of Christ. And these are guys who, you know, the closest they feel they could get to the film industry was by working at Blockbuster, which may be in a way why Kevin Smith and Troy Duffy were idolised the way they were, since there was an air of, well, if these average guys can do it, then maybe I can too. And I don't know whether the existence of Overnight, the documentary again, which didn't paint Troy Duffy in an entirely flattering light, pushed the film further into the spotlight and made it this cult darling. What exactly a cult film tends to be defined as by audience reactions is that they are by intent or content, and often tend to be obscure or unpopular with mainstream audiences of John and Mary's who only go to the cinema twice a year, is that they often tend to be enjoyed ironically. There's a fair number of films considered to be cult classics, probably the most famous one being the Rocky Horror Picture Show, which I have seen at a midnight showing and have the memories burnt into my psyche for eternity. Where you'll often find audience participation, dialogue quoting, and in the case of Rocky Horror, a whole alternative script. Cult films do tend to draw their roots back to the controversial and suppressed films such as those which were outright banned during the video nasty scare of the 1980s in Britain. The one I'm probably most familiar with is, of course, The Evil Dead. And often linked in with this, cult films tend to be controversial ones, with an excess of gore or sexual content, much akin to the exploitation films of the late 60s and early 70s. And so it has been argued by a number of film critics that the event of streaming services will actually cause the death of cult films, as they're able to be accessed here, there, and anywhere, rather than being this small little thing like, there's this film, you have to see it to believe it, but you can only see it by going to this cinema at this time. And you know, there's weight behind the argument. A quote I really liked was one from Alex Cox in the introduction to The Wicker Man on Moviedrome in 1988, which was, what is a cult film? A cult film is one that has a passionate following, but does not appeal to everybody. James Bond films are not cult films, but chainsaw movies are. Just because a movie is a cult film does not automatically guarantee quality. Some cult films are very bad, some are very, very good. Some make an awful lot of money at the box office, others make no money at all. Some are considered quality films, and others are simply, there's that word again, exploitation. Although equally, there's been plenty of work produced which would argue that the phrase cult classic would refer to a film which has a small but devoted following. One I was followed very strongly and might well have fit that was when Firefly was cancelled and had a small but devoted following. Whilst you'll have other authors who say that any film or TV show with a passionate and devoted following is a cult classic, which would mean that you'd have the likes of Star Wars and Lord of the Rings and Star Trek count as cult classics. And those films don't seem to fit into the audiences that I've seen at screenings of the like of the Rocky Horror Picture Show or The Room. But then equally at the same time, there have been equal arguments that there's truly no such thing as a cult classic, and that term is simply a marketing buzzword. So films that are coming out will be labelled as an instant cult classic, simply to draw attention to what they are and try and get it discussed in the wider circles in the long, empty, devastating halls of the internet. However, the most agreed upon definition is that cult films are those which exist outside critical and cultural acceptance, which can cover everything from beach party musicals to softcore pornography, as was defined by Xavier Mendek. But drawing this back to conclude about the Boondock Saints and whether it is a cult film, my opinion ultimately isn't going to change anything. But to me, looking at the Boondock Saints, it doesn't seem to fit the idea of it being outside the critical and cultural acceptance any more than the likes of Punisher Warzone. And whilst it has a small and passionate fan base, so does My Little Pony. They're very different films. And for me, Boondock Saints I found to be a very average film, which was the perfect example of the average direct-to-video 90s action film. And it's debatable whether the events that surrounded its release, again, Columbine, really actually affected its release, or whether because of Troy Duffy's behaviour, the breaking up of the relationship with Miramax had a larger impact on whether the film was successful or not, or very simply, whether it didn't do brilliantly because it's not a very good film. And for me, it's the latter. It is very amateurish in its direction. The actors aren't consistent all the way through. Defoe seems to do whatever the hell he wants. And even the action sequences, which really in this sort of thing should be the big draw, are very clunky and static in a lot of ways. And yet there is a germ of an interesting idea here with one of the later action sequences, which sees it play out in the Saints' minds, and then is gone through by Defoe, who points out how it actually would have happened. And even though there's a character called Rocco in the film who probably is the best thing about it, I'd say, he isn't given like this invincible plot armor and isn't a born genius or weapon master like the brothers. And the brothers, whilst again Norman Reedus and Sean Patrick Flannery have great natural chemistry, but they do play out like a trench coat wearing, dual gun wielding, wish fulfillment fantasy from an angry young teenager. And having watched the film, I've got no desire to watch the sequel and have more of the same, nor will I be joining the cult of Boondock anytime soon. But I'm almost in a way I'm glad I watched it, because I'm always a lover of seeing what the fuss is about, and now I feel I know what the fuss is about with the Boondock Saints. It's actually no, I take that back. I don't know what the fuss is about the Boondock Saints. It's a cult classic, and I don't understand why. Maybe I will one day. Thank you very much for watching. I'll be back in a few days' time where we're looking at, what have I got on my list? A Ben Stiller comedy. We're doing Night at the Museum. If you thought this was bad, you ain't seen nothing yet. Thank you again for watching. See you then.